Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
COVID-19 has unintentionally made huge cuts to global carbon emissions. With people traveling less and spending more time at home, some are suggesting we should more seriously consider lasting changes to combat climate change. According to an essay in the Wall Street Journal, though, quote, human and economic costs should give pause to those who imagine remaking the world's habits of consumption, end quote. What are they talking about? Well, on The State of Us, you all know that we do believe climate change to be a serious problem, but we've also been skeptical and hesitant to embrace certain solutions in the past as we debate how effective certain solutions might be. And that's kind of what today's episode is about. Ultimately, climate change is something that will affect all of us in one way or another. We all live on this planet, at least for now, and that means we have to address it seriously. At the same time, COVID-19 has given us this unique opportunity to examine what happens when we cut emissions. What would it really mean if we made some serious changes? And what do we have the opportunity to do right now as a result of what's going on? Those are some of the things that we're going to look to answer today, in addition to talking about the legitimate arguments against why we should not make some of those changes. To find out the answers to those, well, you're going to have to stick around. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the climate and the economy without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
You can't talk about climate change and the pandemic without talking about the economy and the effect of the pandemic on the economy as people try to go back to work. That's a major factor. And yes, the climate in the world has improved from, being able to see more and the canals of Venice cleaning up and cities not, being as smog covered in the summer. But then the cost is people need to go back to work. And so as you factor in the economy, people's interest in climate starts to wane a little bit. But is there a way that I want to look at? Is there a way that we can put the two together? Can we get the economy running again and still take care of the climate? And that's where there seems to be a huge debate. So a lot of things lined up today, an interesting show.
So we've got two different articles. As always, they're linked at thestateofus.org. The first one we're talking about is from the New York Times, and it kind of does a decent job, Lance, of laying out a couple of things, but we'll be jumping back and forth between them, one from the Wall Street Journal, one from the New York Times. So be sure to follow along. I first want to share a little bit, Lance, before we talk about kind of the two perspectives, right? The two sides, a little bit about how impactful has this been to the climate, right? Well, the International Energy Agency recently concluded that, quote, global CO2 emissions are expected to decline by 8% in 2020, or almost 2.6 billion tons. And by the way, Lance, just to put that in perspective, those are levels from 10 years ago. So if we rewound 10 years ago, that's where we would have been back then. So it's a pretty substantial drop in emissions, unprecedented and impressive, according to the Wall Street Journal article, and it's by far the biggest year-to-year reduction since World War II. So it's certainly notable from at least an observational standpoint. That said, though, the Center for International Climate Research in Norway estimates that by 2100, this year's enormous reduction will bring down global temperatures by less than 1/500th of a degree Fahrenheit. So almost nothing. And that's kind of the crux of today's conversation is one-time things like this don't have that much of an impact in the long haul. Yes, they make for interesting case studies, but if we aren't able to maintain things like this in the long run, they don't make that much of a difference. So the other thing that we have to look at is at what cost have these savings come at? Well, you've probably all heard more about the economic costs, right? In the United States, in the second quarter, lost more than 1/5 of GDP and eliminated millions of jobs across the country and around the world. So it's come at huge economic costs. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more later. But Lance, let's lay out the two sides a little bit, right? We've got the green militants and the diehard industrialists, and they both have different perspectives about what this situation presents, right? Some want to use this as an opportunity. Others want to use this to go back to the way things were before.
Well, and just to go back to the stats, you have places, and I'm not trying to bash on China, but China has already upped its emissions. By May, they had already upped their emissions back to where they were pre-COVID for them. So you have the industrialized world that as they get back to work, these emissions are going to increase. And then, it's easy for us to sit here in the developed countries and say, well, this is what we ought to do when the majority of people in the world are struggling to make ends meet. And unfortunately, they need to burn the carbon fuels right now to try to make enough money to grow enough food or to have enough money to buy food to eat and stay alive. So, we have to be careful of not being hypocrites while we have all of these things to say other people ought to live a certain way. At least that's my perspective. And that's where you get in with the green militants to kind of move into the question you asked me is, they're like, hey, let's go now. Things are getting better. Let's just use this as a jumping off point to continue this. And, but unfortunately, and you can jump in here. It looks like if we continue down this road, we're asking for more government investment or more private capitalist investment in green energy, in these resources, to cut the emissions and things. It's going to cost a lot of money before we see any, real gain from this. And the problem is we're already throwing a lot of money at this pandemic to try to keep people afloat. So how much are people willing to pay for? That's what I would say to those who are totally on the green side, that your ideas and your desires are very well intentioned, but we're talking about somebody's going to have to pay for all of this. For the diehard industrialists who just say, you know what, we got to get back to burning oil and coal and keep these jobs that we've had for 75 to 100 years. We got to keep those things going. No, we don't, we can find different ways to maybe still do that. And some of the leaders in Europe have proposed some of those things where, we can help the car industry, but let's tie it to electric cars, making more electric cars and better batteries for those cars. So, there's a way I think here, and it's like almost everything else we talk about on this show, we've got to find some middle ground. You've got the two extremists here who are, we have to just get rid of everything because we got to save the planet and we got to keep burning all the fossil fuels because we got to get the economy going. And there's got to be something there in the middle, even though the argument against that is that, well, little changes make little changes. It's doing a little bit only helps the environment a little bit, or it only helps the economy a little bit, so there's some drastic things that need to be done. And when you have these two polar opposites, it makes it really tough.
Well, and I think you touched on a couple important things, and it's almost like there's an outline for the show and you knew what's coming in the second segment and you wanted to give our listeners a little taste, because part of what
there is? I didn't know that. There's an outline? I just sit here and talk. I didn't know we had an outline.
You just show up, right? I'm here, I'm ready.
The voices are talking to me in my head, and I'm just talking. I'm just sharing what the voices are saying.
They're saying good things today. They're concise. They've got it figured out. But we are going to talk about some, Lance. How much can any individual do, right? Because it's a recurring question when we talk about climate, but also the idea, and you touched on this, of how much does a little change make? And what would a big change look like? Because I think that's the bigger question, right? Is this has given us a taste of what could happen if we made some serious changes, but how do you make serious changes that not only are the right thing for the climate, but also the right thing for the economy? The good news is, like you pointed out, we shouldn't have to choose between them. And we may actually, as unfortunate as the COVID-19 pandemic is, there could very well be a way to turn this in our favor, right? And use it at least to our advantage from an aspect of we have to reinvest in the economy. Where do we reinvest?
Do you think there is a common ground between these two sides that we can find that would really make a difference?
Well, the last time that we talked kind of specifically about climate was our Should You Buy an Electric Car in 2020 episode. And I think part of what we talked about on that episode, for people that have been listening a while, they might recall, that the ideological spectrum on this has shifted, and even young conservatives believe climate change to be a real problem and believe that investing in it's important. Also, green energy, is accounting for a much larger share of energy production as a whole and has become a pretty thriving industry all by itself. So the questions of, it's not affordable to do it or it's not practical, are some of those still legitimate in certain ways? Sure, but they're not even close to what they were just 10 years ago. And so that's kind of where, and this to me, Lance, is what I think the author of the article in the Wall Street Journal, who also wrote a book about this, what he's trying to get at is saying, if we get serious about investing in it, we only know where it'll take us. It could become more valuable to the economy than fossil fuels have ever been. We just don't know because we haven't put in enough time and haven't had it long enough to have the same level of innovation that we've seen in other industries. So yes, things like solar energy have gotten, incredibly better. At the same time, they're not where they have to be in order to be a suitable 100% replacement. There's still issues that are faced that have to be addressed in order for it to be something practical where we can say we're going to get rid of the old thing. Because right now it's nice to add it, but it can't replace it because there's too many obstacles to replacing it. And that's kind of what we talk about coming up. That's where the opportunity lies, right? As we're reopening and thinking about where we're putting money, that's where the opportunity lies. But the question of, can you make a difference, you personally, right? Great. Climate change, we're accepting that it's a challenge. Is there anything you can do or do your small changes only make small changes? And when you make small changes, do you then make other decisions that actually make things worse? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The author of the article in the Wall Street Journal writes, climate change is a real problem with substantial and growing overall negative impacts toward the end of the century. And those who are serious about it, from across the political and ideological spectrum, know that trying to change patterns of consumption is not nearly enough. Much more important will be developing a range of cheaper, cleaner energy sources. And that's kind of where we left off, Lance, right at the end of last segment, is basically saying all of this is great. This stuff that we have in development, green energy, right? It's all very promising, but so much of it, solar energy is an easy example. The downsides to solar are pretty negligible in terms of, its negative output. Like wind turbines, one of the things that always comes to mind is lowering property values, noise, wind direction, whatever, right? There's a lot of things that people may cite as inherently flawed with wind energy. Now, we're not going to go into that right now, but solar is one of those you look at, and the biggest drawback, right, to it replacing something like coal burning power plants is that the sun's not shining all the time. And so you have these peak hours in the middle of the day where you generate a whole bunch, and then you have all night where you're not generating anything. And at the moment, no practical way to store that power. So the point in all of this, right, is not to harp on saying, well, green energy is no good, but that's why we're talking about this being an opportunity to make green energy better and, right, create jobs in the new economy that will last a long time. Because again, whether or not you want to face it, at some point, fossil fuels will not be a sustainable option for us. At some point, they run out, Lance, right?
That's the key point to remember. And the original question here, though, is, does anything that we do as an individual matter? And it's like, well, yeah, it does. If you unplug your phone charger and and you turn off lights and don't run things quite as often, or, wash your clothes in cold or cooler water. Those things help. But like I said before, the point of the article, which I took and, had to point the finger at myself a little bit, is, my little things that I do help a little bit. Me doing those things isn't going to make it snow more at the polar ice caps and, put more snow on the glaciers to keep them from melting, which is causing the oceans to rise and causing more storms and flooding. So it's like, what I took from this is, we have to keep doing those individual things, but we have to do bigger individual things if we really want to make a difference. And those bigger individual things turn to then, as our nation and as our world, we have to do things, because as we put these demands on things, we have to make sure we're doing things to lift up those people who don't have the money to invest all of this in all these things, to help them stay alive as well. We can't just write off half of the world's population because we have to save the planet. I mean, I guess we can, excuse me there. I misspeak. We can do that. That is an option, and probably takes care of some of the issues that we have if we just, lose half the people in this world. But I don't want to be the person to decide which half that is. I think we need to lift each other up. That's a much better way to solve the problem, is to lift each other up and find ways to help people meet in the middle to do some of these things that we were talking about. But you said it all when you said, the real point here of the whole matter is fossil fuels aren't going to exist forever. And we can argue all day long, that, well, they said it were going to run out 30 years ago and we still have plenty and we're still finding new. You're right. It is. But eventually, guys, it is going to run out. I don't know when eventually.
It's not a bottomless pit.
I don't know when eventually is, whether it's in my lifetime or not, or in yours or Devin's, but at some point it will run out. So why not prepare for that rather, be proactive rather than reactive?
Well, and back to your little changes, Lance, I think the big key here that you and I, when we've talked about them, because we always tell people you should make the little changes, right? Because even making a change is better than making no change. The problem with that is that often when we make a change, we then do something else bad in exchange for having done something good. And then that totally negates the purpose of having done. So then you're not getting a little change, right? And this is known as moral licensing. Okay. And it's this idea.
So there's a phrase for what I do.
Yes. Moral licensing.
There's a phrase for me buying a Camry that gets 40 miles to the gallon. And I know it's not an electric car, but I felt really good about that. And then, 6 months to a year later, I go out and buy a big old pickup truck that gets 12 miles a gallon.
Moral licensing.
So I really didn't help. That's moral licensing.
Because,
so there's a name for that.
Because, right, okay. And this is something we do in all areas of life, people, right? This is not just it's a human behavior. It's not just climate related, but unfortunately in the climate situation, it's very bad because what Lance did's great, right? He bought an efficient vehicle that reduces emissions by driving it as opposed to driving something else. But because he did something good, he then gave himself permission to do something bad and purchase an energy inefficient vehicle. And this takes place across all sorts of areas, but it's been studied specifically at the annual conference of the Agricultural Economic Society in 2012. What they did is they analyzed shopping behavior in the United Kingdom, and they found, Lance, that the more consumers purchase energy-saving light bulbs or use eco bags or reuse their own bags, the more likely their weekly shopping is to contain red meat and bottled water whose carbon footprints are sizable, right?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
I read that and I'm like, oh man, point 3 fingers at me, because it's like, I'm big on my reusable bags.
Yes.
And here's my justification, right? I mean, I'm doing some good stuff, so it's countering my bad stuff, but that doesn't help. But that doesn't help the environment. But it's so hard to make those changes.
I mean, I struggled with this when I was trying to lose weight, and it's something you really have to overcome. Is it's that idea, right? Of, well, I was good all day, so now I'm going to eat this brownie, right, or this piece of chocolate cake.
That's my daily fight, sir.
Right, and so then you didn't eat less, right? The whole goal was to have eaten less for the day, and you ate less the whole day, and then you ate something that was your whole day's calories in one sitting. It's very difficult because we do that in all areas of life. It's the same idea of like, if you go and you donate some money to a charity, then you go out and you buy something nice for yourself. That's why it's really important to think about, because the small changes can make a difference. Yes, they'll make a small difference, but they won't even make a small difference if you're not vigilant about, well, I recycled my plastic bottle, but then I wasted a piece of tinfoil by folding it over and throwing it in the trash.
You lose something, what they call the rebound effect. Like you gain, you did all of these good things. And then when you do the moral licensing and you buy more bad things for the economy, or you drive a inefficient vehicle or whatever, then that's what we're talking about here, is this rebound effect. And the article points out, across a wide range of activities, the study that in the report estimated that 59% of emissions savings from, quote, virtuous behavior are lost to the rebound effect. So that moral
59%.
Yeah. So 60% of the good things you did were thrown away when we practice that psychological effect of moral licensing. And that's just, that just hits me in the head like, dude, you have to stay strong and be better all the way through.
Well, I caught myself, Lance, the other day. I mean, from the episode, right, that Brett and I now own an electric vehicle. And this is the first electric vehicle we've ever owned. And we love it. We drive it all over, but we still have gas vehicles, right? But we took it, we're going a little ways. We're going an hour. It's like, well, we'll take the electric vehicle, right? Because, I mean, obviously, if we're both going, there's no reason to take the gas vehicle. So we take it, we stop on the way, coffee place, right? Get some coffee. Well, I didn't get coffee because I don't care for it, but and now our listeners hate me. But or 80%.
And I drink 80%. A pot of coffee a day. That's why I'm so wired all the time, even though it is decaf, in deference to my doctor, which, I don't like, but I do. So, I'm drinking hot water, but still, it still has some caffeine in it. I did read that decaffeinated coffee.
That's right.
So I drink enough for both of us, so people can keep listening.
Okay. We're still taking care of the coffee industry.
Right.
Lance is making up my shortfall. But anyway, we stopped, we got some coffee, right? Well, we got these come in plastic containers, of course.
So why are you driving an electric car, dude?
Oh no, it gets worse. Don't you worry. and then, right. So we go, we're going on a trail, you get done with the trail and the drinks are finished and it's time to get rid of them. Well, there's a recycling bin that's, 20 feet away, and there's a trash can that's right next to us on the path, right? So what happens? Well, a couple individuals throw it in the trash, and I said, there was a recycling bin 20 feet away. And they said, oh, well, it was 20 feet away. And I said, well, I guess that's okay, right? Because we drove the electric vehicle here. So, see, I know.
Be still my heart. You jump on me all the time for that kind of stuff.
I know. I know.
Man.
So
thanks for being honest. I hope your soul feels better.
Well, yeah, that's what it's about, right? Getting our listeners to know that you and I, we're saying these things and we are trying to think about them, but that's the point in talking about them, is if we're aware of them, we're less likely to do them. People don't want to do things they intentionally know are bad. And if you understand moral licensing, you're less likely to take advantage of it, or at least think about it twice. And that does have an opportunity to make an effect. But Lance, we got to talk about, what are the big changes, right? We've talked this segment about, okay, small changes. How much do they matter? How do you avoid, actually having an effect? Well, now we need to look at the economic reasons to address climate change. What would be the benefits of addressing climate change, but also the challenges that were presented by it? And should we just give up? Because you're going to hear some stuff and it's like, oh, this is discouraging. I mean, maybe you've heard it in this segment, right? It's like, well, man, I recycle, but also I buy bottled water. So am I really, should we just quit? Is it not worth trying? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
What the pandemic tells us about climate change. Well, that's what we've been looking at today. It has given us some insight, and it's let us re-examine things like how big of a difference do we make? Well, in the last segment, Lance and I talked some about that, right? Small changes make small changes. Now, that may seem pretty self-explanatory, but we did talk about moral licensing and how, in fact, small changes may make almost no change at all because we often make decisions as a result, either directly or indirectly, that offset those effects. So that can be kind of discouraging, especially if you're out there, you care about the climate, right? You'd like to see us make some changes, and you might be one of those people. Ever since I read this article, Lance, because we actually read it back at the beginning of July, and we had purchased our electric vehicle back then, Brett and I did, and me in particular, I feel real bad when I do things now where you notice, where you're consciously aware, like, this is not a good thing for the environment. And I know there's an alternative, right, that I just am not taking the time to explore. Because as you and I have talked about, a lot of times they can be either cheaper or the same cost, and all it takes is putting in the actual effort to make the change. But often we hesitate in doing that. And this segment's not so much right about the small changes, but more about what about the big changes? What would it look like? What would it mean to the economy? Well, the Wall Street Journal article, Lance, it tells us that a professor at Yale, who in 2018 was awarded the first Nobel Prize for work in climate economics, he tabulated all of the estimates of climate-related economic damages from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he peer-reviewed studies to determine the total impact of different levels of global temperature increases. So in other words, how much of an impact does climate change have on the global economy? That's what we want to know. Well, he found that by 2050, the net negative impact of unmitigated climate change, so if we don't really change what we're doing, that is with current emission trends unabated, is equivalent to losing about 1% of global GDP every year. So by 2100, the loss will be about 4% of global GDP a year. As the planet warms, as people are forced to move, as gas prices go up, as things like that happen, as energy prices rise, global GDP is affected as a result of that. And that's part of what makes this hard, because here's the counter to that, Lance. For comparison, what it would cost to reach net zero by 2050, right? And this is the thing that we hear everybody talk about, right? Net zero by 2050. Well, so far, only one country, New Zealand, has actually commissioned an independent estimate to say, what would that cost us? What would it take to get there for New Zealand? Well, it turns out the optimistic cost is a whopping 16% of GDP, not by 2050, but every year all the way to 2050. That's what it would cost New Zealand. Now, keep in mind, to put this in perspective, what does 16% of GDP look like for New Zealand? Well, 16% is more than New Zealand spends right now on social security, welfare, health, education, police, courts, defense, environment, and every other part of the government combined. So New Zealand's entire government operation is less expensive than it would be for New Zealand to reach net zero by 2050. So incredibly expensive to do based on today's numbers. So what this looks like, I think, right, Lance, is that it's like, well, my gosh, this isn't worth it, because in the short term, it's going to cost us a fortune. And that's part of why climate's always been such a hard sell for people, is because for most, everybody here that's alive today, right? If we kept on going the way we were going, would we see real changes in our lifetime based on estimates? Absolutely. Would our lives be the same? No, there are definitely going to be differences as a result of climate. But are we still going to get by? Are things still going to be generally okay, especially if you live in a first world country? Probably. The people that it's going to hit the hardest are the ones that have the least. And this is the thing that makes it tough, is that 100 years from now, those are the people that will feel the pains of what we do today. Not choosing to make the hard choices now will negatively impact future generations, because they will have to spend 2 or 3 times as much to not only stop the damage, but to reverse the damage.
And so many people, myself included, we live in the moment, right? We live for today, tomorrow. We don't think of tomorrow in terms of later in life. I'm doing that more now, obviously being older. I look back and I think, oh man, if I had made changes in my diet or my exercise pattern, how much better off I would be now. But you can't tell that to 20 somethings today for the most part, because they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about tomorrow, and you can't tell that and I think that's where it comes into with this environmental issue. You're asking people to sacrifice today for a time that they may not even be on the planet unless our, immortality Inc. takes place and we all get to live 400 or 500 years.
See?
If that were the case, then this would be an easier sell. And I'm not really trying to be funny. I think this is a tough sell to people to tighten their belt and to make the sacrifices now for a generation that doesn't even exist. Why should I care about now when I may not be alive tomorrow, or when I won't be alive when all of this is going to go down and get ugly and nasty? And that's a really hard human psychological thing to overcome. But I think you bring up the point is it's going to be tough, and people need to realize that you can't just use reusable bags and buy an electric car and that solves the problem. We have to have some real, not only government buy-in around the world to make this happen, but some economic investment in this from business as well, and saying, we're not going to worry about the bottom line. We're not going to worry about our stock investors. We're going to do the things that are best for the human race. And I don't know if you can do that or not. I'm not sold. My pessimistic glass half full, half empty, my half empty bottle, is winning out here, because I don't know if people are willing to do that. Now, can it be done? Sure. Do we want to go back? Because it's done very easily, and we have proof in the United States of when it was done back in, post World War II, when the tax rate was really high and companies then invested in the future because there was no significant gain by keeping all your money because you were just going to pay it to the government in taxes. So there was a lot of investment in the workers and the infrastructure and the company and making it run better, because better to spend your profits on your company and on your employees than it is to just turn it over and write a check to the government. But that's not the way we're going right now. It's all about tax cuts. Everybody wants a tax cut. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of it. I'm saying, how do you get there? I'm trying to solve the problem. I think we need to increase the corporate tax, and you're going to get all the pushback on that's going to make things more expensive. Exactly. You're going to have to make that sacrifice, and you're not going to have all of the things that you normally would have, because it is going to become more expensive.
It's a big consideration because I'll give you an example that came to mind for me the other day. You and I have talked a little bit on climate episodes before about one of the ways the United States is a bad contributor, right? We're one of the few countries in the world where toilet paper consumption we're the only country in the world where toilet paper consumption is at the rate it is in this country. Well, why is that? Well, because most companies use bidets instead, right? Which is the idea of washing as opposed to merely wiping. And the whole point here is why? Because two things, and this is the key, it's even when it benefits people, it can be a difficult sell. Switching from toilet paper, and you don't get rid of toilet paper, by the way. You still have toilet paper, but you just use far less. Installing a bidet can reduce toilet paper usage by as much as 80%. The studies have been done. The evidence is in. It's clear because other countries have been using them for years. As a whole, you, the consumer, you save money, right? Money by doing it. And you make back the money that you spend on your average bidet in the first year. And then they last, unless I don't know what you would do that would break them, but hopefully, they last 5-10 years. And so and these are substantial, because if you go home and add up, right, what you spend on toilet paper in a year, and you can have 80% of that back, why would you not do that? Well, your vanity, your pride, your whatever, right, gets in the way. Not wanting to change, not wanting to do whatever it is. Because
your cultural norm, what you're used to.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And that's just a small example. It's the same thing that you and I talked about, Lance, with the electric vehicle, right? People have, and I had this skepticism. I had this hesitation, right? It was very real. I was nervous. Did I want an electric vehicle? Sure. I mean, for most people, it's not if I could have an electric vehicle and it did everything the gas vehicle did, okay. But for most people, they don't understand, right? Because it takes time to learn. And you and I talked about the economic benefit of owning an electric vehicle, what it saves you. But at the same time, those changes still don't get made, in part because at the moment we have a government that's divided, right? We've turned this into, at least we have in the past, 20 years. It didn't used to be this way, just for the record, right? When we first started to discover that climate change was a real problem, everybody was on the same page about this has to be addressed. And then it became politicized because, why? Not because the politicians thought it needed to be, but because the people that pay the politicians, the big money interests, said, hey, we got to get on this because they're coming for us. And that's why it changed. And this whole mentality that Lance was talking about of, we don't worry about investing in the next generation. We worry about taking care of ours. Well, for all you millennials and Gen Zers out there, that's exactly why we have the world that we're in right now. So if you've, thought about it and said moral licensing, can I really do anything different? Well, sure you can. And choosing not to means that you're making the same decision that our parents and their parents made about leaving us in the situation we're in, about not securing the American dream for the next generation, about leaving us with a world where we are going to make less money on average than they did, and where we overall will have a lower quality of life than them. So if we want to continue that, let's keep thinking that way, because that's exactly where it will get us. The only way it changes is to make the hard choices. And as Lance pointed out, it's happened before, right? It can be done. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of will we make the decision to make it happen.
You could become known as the greatest generation 2.0.
The generation that saved Earth, right?
Right.
Or not. Or we could also be the generation that killed Earth because we had the data, we had the information, and we had the opportunity, and we decided not to take it. And that's the whole thing again, is that long term, it's good for the economy too, right, Lance? I mean, that's kind of the point.
Exactly. Right. We're talking about things that can help us, not just the environment, but help the economy and help us live a better life and a richer life as well. So, but the important thing about this is that we talk about these things because our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And you've got to share this. This doesn't happen with one or two of us doing it, or 5 or 10,000 of us doing it. We've all got to get on board and make this important and make those, people that don't agree with us understand why it's so important. And one way to do that is to get more people to listen to the show and, let them know that what we're doing here at True Chat and that you support it and they need to listen, and they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, and our editing producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.